At 4:58 p.m., she was dismissed in front of everyone. No warning, no exit plan. By midnight, a quiet thread of emails began to surface. At 2:45 a.m., legal opened a report no one expected to exist, and everything shifted. The room had that polished stillness that only expensive offices know how to hold. Glass walls, muted carpets, controlled lighting, everything calibrated to signal control. Even the silence felt curated. She was already seated when the VP walked in. No greeting, no pause, just a folder placed on the table with a precision that felt rehearsed. "Your attitude is unacceptable," he said, as if reading from an internal memo. "We're ending this effective immediately." No one moved. Not the HR partner, not the two managers sitting along the wall, pretending to study their notes. Even the air conditioning seemed to lower its hum, as if it didn't want to interrupt the moment. She blinked once, then slowly closed her laptop. Not a slam, not a gesture of frustration, just a quiet, deliberate click. The kind that sounds insignificant until you realize it's the last action someone takes before everything changes. "Understood," she said. Her voice didn't rise, didn't fall. It landed exactly where it needed to. That, more than anything, unsettled the room. The VP shifted slightly in his chair. He had expected resistance, or emotion, or at least a question. But this was frictionless. And frictionless things in corporate environments are rarely simple. HR cleared her throat, sliding a document forward. "We'll need your signature here," she said, soft but procedural. "Standard separation acknowledgement." The paper stopped just within reach. She didn't touch it. Instead, she glanced at the header, then the footer, then, briefly, the middle, where most people never look. A pause, 3 seconds, maybe 4, long enough for someone observant to notice she wasn't reading. She was confirming. Then she picked up the pen, signed. No edits, no hesitation. No request for clarification, just her name, written in a clean, controlled line that didn't tremble once. The VP exhaled through his nose, almost imperceptibly. There it was. Closure. Or so he thought. "It will deactivate your access within the hour," one of the managers added, still not looking at her directly. "We'll coordinate retrieval of company property." She nodded once. "Of course." Then she reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and placed it face down on the table. Not to use it, but as if marking a point in time. A quiet timestamp no one else understood. Across the glass wall, employees moved between desks, unaware that a termination was unfolding meters away. Someone laughed in the distance. Someone poured coffee. Normalcy continued, perfectly intact. Inside the room, however, something had already shifted. "Is there anything else?" the VP asked, now leaning back slightly, eager to conclude. She looked at him for the first time since he'd spoken. A measured look, not confrontational, not submissive, just precise. "No," she said. "Everything seems aligned." The word hung there for a fraction too long. Aligned. It sounded like agreement. It didn't feel like it. She stood up, adjusted her blazer, and took her laptop, now just a piece of hardware, stripped of authority. As she turned toward the door, her reflection caught in the glass panel. Composed, almost detached, like someone stepping out of a role she'd already finished playing. The HR partner opened the door for her. "Thank you," she said. Polite, professional, final. Her heels moved softly across the corridor, fading into the same background rhythm as everyone else's day. No scene, no disruption, no visible trace of what had just happened. Back in the room, the VP closed the folder. "Well," he said almost casually, "that was straightforward." No one responded, because somewhere between the signature and the silence, a subtle doubt had already entered the room, uninvited but unmistakable. Something about it had been too clean, too precise, too prepared, and no one could quite explain why that felt like a problem. At 5:07 p.m., her access was terminated. At 5:09 p.m., the system logs registered something no one noticed. Yet, and far from that quiet office, beyond the glass, beyond the city's last lit windows, something else was already in motion, moving through inboxes that hadn't been checked, toward people who weren't expecting anything at all, the kind of motion that doesn't announce itself until it's too late to ignore. At 5:12 p.m., the office returned to its usual rhythm with unsettling efficiency. Calendar invites resumed. Slack notifications flickered back to life. Someone in finance asked a routine question about Q3 allocations. The machinery of the company didn't pause. It never does. It simply absorbed the absence and kept moving. Her name disappeared from internal directories within minutes. By 5:18 p.m., it was as if she had never been there. Almost. In the IT operations dashboard, a single flag appeared, small, colorless, easy to overlook. A background process that had been scheduled weeks ago completed its final step. No alert was triggered, no escalation protocol activated, because technically nothing was wrong, and that was precisely the problem. At 6:03 p.m., the VP was already in another meeting. Different room, same glass walls, same posture of controlled authority. "We need to accelerate the rollout," he said, tapping the table lightly for emphasis. "No delays. Legal has already cleared the structure." Across from him, the head of strategy nodded, though slower than usual. "Cleared? Based on the latest documentation?" she asked. A subtle question, easy to dismiss. The VP didn't hesitate. "Of course." But the answer came too quickly. And somewhere in the room, that registered. At 7:26 p.m., an email was opened in legal. Subject line, "Revised liability exposure, immediate review," suggested it wasn't marked urgent. It didn't need to be. The sender field was blank in the way internal system-generated messages often are: functional, impersonal, easy to trust; attached, a report, 42 pages, dense, structured, precise. At first glance, it looked like any other compliance summary: tables, projections, disclaimers buried in controlled language. But then the reviewer paused, scrolled back, checked a section twice, then a third time, because line by line, the numbers didn't align with what had been approved. They diverged, quietly, systematically, and always in one direction: up. At 8:14 p.m., another copy of the same report reached finance. Different inbox, same attachment. This time it was opened faster. "Is this version final?" someone asked across the room. No one answered immediately, because no one recognized it. At 9:02 p.m., the first internal call happened. Not scheduled, not documented. Just a direct line between legal and finance. "Where did this come from?" "We're trying to verify. These figures, are they modeled or actual?" "They're tied to executed clauses." A pause. "Which clauses?" Silence on the other end, because now they were both looking at the same page. Section reference, section 11. Not new, not recently edited. Just previously unexamined. At 10:37 p.m., the VP received a forwarded copy. He opened it halfway through a conversation, expecting a routine update, then stopped reading mid-sentence. The room kept talking around him, unaware that his focus had shifted entirely. $60 million. The number didn't shout. It sat there, flat, clinical, undeniable. He scrolled further. Cross-references, sign-offs, timestamps. Everything looked legitimate. Everything was legitimate. And yet, "This isn't possible," he said, more to himself than anyone else. But the report didn't respond. It simply existed. At 11:48 p.m., legal escalated. Formally this time. Subject line updated. Urgent. Liability exposure. Confirmation required. Recipients expanded. Executives added. Outside counsel looped in. Because by now the pattern was clear. This wasn't a projection, it was an obligation. At 2:45 a.m., the call happened. No video, just voices. Tired, focused, controlled. "We've reviewed the full chain," counsel said. "There's no procedural error." A quiet inhale on the other end. "Then explain the exposure." A pause, longer this time, because explanations require distance, and there wasn't any left. It's tied to the termination sequence, counsel continued carefully, specifically the execution timing relative to pre-existing contractual protections. Another silence. He didn't need to ask the question. He already knew the answer was coming. The liability was triggered the moment the separation was formalized. The line held steady. No interruptions, no objections, just the slow, unmistakable realization settling into place. $60 million wasn't a scenario. It was a consequence. At 3:12 a.m., one final message was drafted. Short, direct, unavoidable. Contact us urgently. It was sent, not to a department, not to a group, to one person. Somewhere, far from the office, her phone lit up briefly in the dark. She didn't reach for it immediately, because unlike everyone else, she already knew what it would say. And more importantly, why? If this moment made you pause, even for a second, subscribe now, because the next chapter reveals what was written long before that meeting and why the outcome was never in their control. Her phone stopped vibrating after the third call, not because they gave up, because they recalibrated. By 7:18 a.m., the tone of communication had changed. No more directives, no more internal shorthand. The language shifted, careful, measured, almost deferential. The kind of language companies use when they realize the conversation is no longer internal. Her screen lit up again. An email this time. Subject, request for discussion, urgent. She opened it without hurry. Read it once, then again, slower. The phrasing was precise, intentionally neutral. No admission of error, no mention of liability, just an invitation, framed as alignment, disguised as collaboration. Classic. She placed the phone back on the table and walked to the window. Morning had already settled into the city. Traffic moved in predictable patterns. People crossed streets without hesitation. Everything outside operated on assumptions of stability. Inside, she worked differently. At 8:02 a.m., legal reconvened. Same report, different posture. What are our options? Someone asked. Not if, not whether. Options. Counsel didn't respond immediately. Because the answer wasn't tactical, it was structural. The exposure is anchored in pre-signed protections, he said. Executed months ago. By whom? Another pause. Because attribution, in moments like this, is less about names and more about responsibility. Approved at the executive level, he replied. A subtle shift in the room. Eyes moved. Not dramatically, not openly, just enough. At 8:37 a.m., the VP joined the call. Late, which for him was unusual. We need a path forward, he said, skipping formalities. Containment, reversal, something. Counsel's response came clean, almost surgical. There is no reversal mechanism. Silence. Then mitigation. Limited. How limited? A brief pause. Contractually defined. That landed harder than any number, because defined limits imply prior agreement, and prior agreement implies consent. At 9:11 a.m., HR was brought in. Documents reopened. Timelines reconstructed. Every step of the termination reviewed, not for justification, but for sequence. Because sequence determines trigger, and trigger determines consequence. She signed immediately, HR said, almost defensively. No pushback, no delay. Counsel nodded. Yes, he said. That's the point. A few seconds passed before anyone spoke again. You're saying, someone began. I'm saying, counsel interrupted gently, that the absence of resistance was not compliance. Another silence. This one heavier, because now they weren't just reviewing an action, they were reinterpreting it. At 10:26 a.m., a second email was drafted, more direct this time, less neutral. We would like to discuss a resolution. It wasn't sent immediately, because wording matters when leverage shifts. Across the city, she finally sat down. Laptop open, coffee untouched. The same calm expression from the day before, unchanged, as if nothing in her environment had caught up to what had already been set in motion. She opened a document. Not new, not recent, but relevant. A version of something that had been reviewed, revised, and quietly finalized long before anyone thought it would matter. She scrolled to a section most people overlook, not because it's hidden, because it doesn't appear urgent, until it is. Her eyes moved steadily across the text. No hesitation, no surprise, just recognition. Back at the office, the VP read the second draft email again. He didn't like it. It sounded reactive, and reactive meant late. Send it, he said anyway, because delay, at this point, was no longer a strategy. It was exposure. At 11:03 a.m., the message reached her. She didn't open it immediately. Instead, she finished reading her document, closed the file, then finally tapped the notification. Her eyes moved once across the screen, a slight pause at the phrase resolution. Then she leaned back, not to think, but to confirm. Everything was now exactly where it needed to be. At 11:17 a.m., she began typing. Not a long message, not a detailed argument. Just a response calibrated to match the situation, not escalate it, define it. When she hit send, there was no visible shift in her expression, no satisfaction, no relief, because this wasn't a reaction, it was a continuation. At 11:18 a.m., her reply appeared in the VP's inbox. He opened it instantly, read it once, then again, slower, because unlike their messages, hers didn't circle the issue. It framed it, cleanly, precisely. And in doing so, it removed the last layer of ambiguity they had left. The room grew quiet again, not the curated silence from the day before, something denser, more grounded, because now they weren't dealing with uncertainty. They were dealing with structure, and structure, once activated, doesn't negotiate, it executes. At 11:22 a.m., no one in the room spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because, for the first time since 4:58 p.m. the previous day, everyone understood exactly what had happened, and more importantly, what it would cost to change it. At 11:23 a.m., the silence finally broke, but not with confidence. With all due respect, the head of strategy began carefully, we need to understand the boundaries here. Not if they had leverage, but where it ended. The VP didn't respond immediately. His eyes were still on her message, as if reading it again might reveal something he had missed the first 2 times. It didn't, because there was nothing hidden in it. That was the problem. At 11:41 a.m., outside counsel requested a closed session. No assistants, no notes, no recordings, just decision-makers. The structure is self-enforcing, counsel said, placing both hands flat on the table. There's no discretionary layer. Once triggered, it proceeds. Automatically? Someone asked. Functionally. A subtle distinction, but in legal terms, it meant the same thing. No one in the room liked that answer, because automatic systems don't respond to authority. They respond to conditions, and those conditions had already been met. At 12:06 p.m., finance re-entered the conversation. Different data set. Same conclusion. We've run the exposure across 3 scenarios, the analyst said. Best case, partial settlement. Mid case, full payout. Worst case... He stopped. Not because the numbers were unclear, because saying them out loud would make them real. Say it, the VP said. A pause. Then, worst case aligns with the report. $60 million. Again. Not louder. Just heavier. At 12:32 p.m., someone asked the question no one wanted to own. How did this get through? It wasn't directed at anyone specific, which made it more dangerous, because responsibility, when undefined, tends to spread. Counsel answered anyway. It didn't get through, he said. It was approved. That shifted the room, not dramatically, but enough, because approval implies awareness, and awareness implies accountability. At 1:08 p.m., HR revisited the sequence one more time. She didn't negotiate, they said. She didn't ask for time. She just signed. Counsel nodded again. Yes, that's not normal. No, he agreed. It isn't. Another pause. Longer this time. Because now the implication was unavoidable. If someone doesn't negotiate, it's either because they don't understand the position or because they already do. At 1:44 p.m., the VP stood up. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just a quiet shift from seated to standing, as if proximity to the table was no longer useful. We need to contain this, he said. No one corrected him, but no one confirmed it either, because containment assumes something is still movable, and by now that assumption was fragile. Across the city, her second message remained open on the screen. Short, structured, unemotional. It didn't demand, it didn't threaten, it simply referenced clause numbers, execution timing, obligations already defined. There was no interpretation required, only acknowledgement. At 2:17 p.m., a third message was drafted internally, more direct than the last, less guarded. We are prepared to discuss settlement parameters. It sat in draft, because every word in that sentence shifted position, from authority to response. At 2:46 p.m., Finance delivered the final confirmation. All pathways converge, the analyst said. Different routes, same endpoint. No one asked for clarification. They didn't need it. At 3:05 p.m., the VP returned to his seat, not out of habit, out of recognition. Because standing hadn't changed anything. He looked around the room, at legal, at HR, at strategy, then back at the screen, at her message. Still unchanged, still precise, still in control. Send it, he said quietly. This time, no hesitation, because delay was no longer a variable, it was a liability. At 3:07 p.m., the message left the outbox. For the first time in 24 hours, the company wasn't initiating the sequence, it was following it. Across the city, her phone lit up again. She glanced at it. Not immediately, not urgently, just enough to register that the pattern had completed its loop. She opened the message, read it once, then closed her eyes for a brief second, not to think, but to measure. Timing, position, alignment. When she looked back at the screen, nothing in her expression had changed, because there was nothing left to evaluate, only to proceed. At 3:12 p.m., she began typing her final response. Not longer than the others, not more emotional, just definitive, because at this stage, clarity is not a tool, it's a boundary, and boundaries, once drawn, don't require reinforcement. They require recognition. When she pressed send, the sequence didn't escalate. It concluded, not loudly, not visibly, but completely. Back in the office, the reply appeared. No one spoke while the VP read it. No one moved. Because whatever was written there, it didn't introduce a new direction. It confirmed the only one that had ever existed. And for the first time since that quiet click of a laptop the day before, there was no uncertainty left in the room. Only outcome. At 3:13 p.m., the message was no longer a message. It was a decision, fully formed, structurally complete, and impossible to reinterpret. The VP read it once, then again, slower, not searching for weakness this time, just confirming what was already evident. Across the table, legal didn't ask what it said. They already knew the shape of it. Because when a position is built on executed clauses, timing, and silence, there are only so many ways it can end. Proceed, counsel said quietly, not as a suggestion, as a conclusion. At 3:19 p.m., Finance began reallocating, not debating, not modeling, executing. Line items shifted, reserves opened, internal buffers, previously theoretical, became operational. The number didn't change. $60 million remained exactly where it had always been. The difference now was simple. It had moved from risk to commitment. At 3:27 p.m., HR prepared the external framing, carefully worded. Neutral tone, No reference to internal sequence, no mention of timing, no acknowledgement of trigger conditions. Just a standard line. The company and the former employee have reached a mutual resolution. Mutual. A word designed to compress complexity into something manageable. But inside the building, no one used it. Because nothing about the past 24 hours had been mutual, it had been precise. At 3:42 p.m., the final confirmation was issued. Not publicly, not broadly, just to the necessary parties. Approved, authorized, locked. There were no follow-up questions, no secondary reviews, no last-minute objections, because everything that could have been debated had already been decided long before the meeting where it all appeared to begin. Across the city, she closed her laptop. The same motion as before, the same quiet click, but this time it didn't mark an ending. It marked completion. Her coffee was still untouched. The morning light had shifted slightly, stretching longer across the floor. Outside, nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. She stood, adjusted her jacket, and walked toward the door. No urgency, no hesitation, just movement, clean, uninterrupted, and entirely her own. At 4:05 p.m., the office resumed its rhythm again. Meetings continued. Emails circulated. New priorities replaced old ones with efficient indifference, because that's what systems do. They adapt. They absorb. They continue. But somewhere beneath that surface, quiet, structured, and now permanently recorded, there was a sequence no one would forget. A termination that wasn't just a decision, but a trigger. A silence that wasn't absence, but execution. And a moment that looked like control, until it wasn't. No one in the room mentioned her name again that day. They didn't need to, because the outcome spoke with more clarity than any conversation could. And in that clarity, one detail remained impossible to ignore. She hadn't resisted. She hadn't argued. She hadn't asked for anything. She had simply closed her laptop. Silence.